Our short story was The Jilting of Granny Weatherall.
The story The Jilting of Granny Weatherall is a story about an 80-year-old woman who is sick and dying. Her daughter Cornelia is there taking care of her in the beginning and throughout the rest of the story, and Dr. Harry in the beginning is taking care of her and examining her, and Granny really doesn't accept or admit that she's dying in the beginning, but throughout the story she does acknowledge that she is dying. She goes on to talk about cleaning and ordering things in her life, which I found was a very weird thing to think about when you're dying in your deathbed, but I guess that is something that comforts her and makes her feel at peace. The next characters introduced are Lydia and Jimmy, her 2 children, and then John is introduced, who is her husband who passed away, and she had her children with him, and she mentions how she wants to tell him that she did such a great job raising her children, but then she mentions that that was for tomorrow, which is an indication and context clue that John is dead and Granny will be passing away, and she can talk to John tomorrow and tell him how great she did with the children. Her next deathbed thought is thinking of her children and memories that she had when they were younger, and then she continues to talk about her fiance George, who left her at the altar, which is where the title The Jilting of Granny Weatherall comes from, because to jilt means to suddenly reject or abandon, usually a lover. As Granny is looking back at all these events in her life, the story is using flashback to portray all these events. The plot progresses by Granny becoming sicker and sicker, and she starts to become confused of her surroundings. She mistakes her daughter Lydia for Hapsy, and at this point, Hapsy seems to be the only child that is not there. Author mentions that Hapsy is who Granny really wanted to see, and then Granny goes through a hallucination of finding Hapsy and seeing Hapsy with a baby in her arms, and Granny goes from being Hapsy then to being the baby in Hapsy's arms. This is a really weird image because there's dialogue of Hapsy saying, "I thought you'd never come," and that is sort of weird because Granny is the one who is dying, so this kind of tells readers that Hapsy may be dead, which there is no textual evidence that specifically says that Hapsy is dead, but from context clues, readers can gather that Hapsy has passed away. It seems as if Hapsy passed away when she was younger and maybe at childbirth. As Granny gets sicker and sicker, she starts to see Hapsy more and more. The author states how Granny made a long journey outward looking for Hapsy, and Granny starts to worry, what if I don't see Hapsy? I don't see her, and she even tells Cornelia, "I'm taken by surprise, I can't go," but obviously she does go on to die. Before she goes, she asks God to give her a sign, and she once again feels abandoned, but this time by God, because God does not give her any sort of sign, and there in the reading is stated, "Oh no, there's nothing more cruel than this. I'll never forgive it." She stretched herself with a deep breath and blew out the light, which is where Granny finally just takes control, and with her feeling of abandonment, she just finally dies. And throughout these last moments of the story, there is some tension created between Granny Weatherall and God.
The narrative perspective of the story is third-person limited. This allows the reader to follow the story through the view of one character's thoughts, emotions, and actions. The character that we follow is Granny Weatherall. The quote shows that it is Granny Weatherall's thoughts and emotions as that we can see, and no other character, which would make it a third-person omniscient. There's also no I's or me's except for when it's Granny's thoughts. This allows us to see that it is Granny's story and Granny telling it, as with the quote in the second quote on the first slide. My dear Lord, this is my death, and I wasn't even thinking about it. My children have come to see me die. There's a lot of I's and me's, which shows that it is her story, her life, her everything revolves around her, and the reader follows that throughout the entire story. The reader follows Granny Weatherall's thoughts throughout the entire story. At the start, being Granny disliking the doctor and thinking about her to-do list for the next day, and later on, wishing she could relive her old days, go back to when she was taking care of her children when they were young, thinking about the jilting that happened to her years ago, and as well, her death. The perspective of the story doesn't change, which allows the story to stay centered on Granny and her thoughts and emotions, as at the start of the story, she begins to realize she's dying, later cope and accept death at the very end. The impact of the point of view that we are given is that it allows us to follow Granny's thoughts and fears and emotions as she dies. Her thoughts and fears about dying revolve around the loss of her control, that she cannot stop herself from dying, that she can't live another day, that she will die, and the jilting that happened to her. And when she finally does begin to die, and she asks for a sign of God, God doesn't give her a sign, and in a way she's jilted again. She loses the control. She can't control God being there. She can't control her living anymore. She's dying, and she's been jilted instead of her ex-fiance, this time by God. And the reader is able to view this and understand it as we've learned more and more of Granny throughout the story, because of the point of view, because of the third person limited, where we are able to view and understand only Granny Weatherall and no other character throughout the entire story. This is the point of impact of the point of view.
The story of the jilting of Granny Weatherall is filled with imagery. There are endless examples of this throughout the piece. The story is given from a third-person point of view, and when combined with the imagery, it gives the reader a good general overview and further develops all of the parts of the story. The use of imagery presents an in-depth look of the characters, the actions within the story, and the settings that surround the characters. Much of the story builds off of itself by presenting the reader with dialogue from one of the characters and then following it by imagery that explains what is occurring or the actions of the characters. The jilting of Granny Weatherall begins with no introduction. The reader is submerged into the developing storyline with no previous understanding of the situation. This means that the author's explanation of all that is occurring is way more important. The imagery of the story is essential for the characterization. Granny Weatherall is developed through the actions and immense description that is presented to the reader. The imagery also further displays the characters' personas by presenting their actions in an illustrative manner. An example of this occurs on page 1. She flicked her wrist neatly out of Dr. Harry's pudgy, careful fingers and pulled the sheet up to her chin. Get along now. Take your schoolbooks and go. There's nothing wrong with me. Quotations like this are dispersed through the story and give the reader a clear image of Granny Weatherall's actions, making the reader feel more in touch with the elements of the story. The action of this story takes place in a bedroom with Granny Weatherall, but this room alongside the many different thoughts inside of Granny Weatherall's head are described to a great extent. While Granny Weatherall is on her deathbed, she seems to be full of imagination and hallucination. Many of these ideas are described in vivid detail by the author, advancing the setting of the story from Granny Weatherall's point of view. An example of this is on page 5, stating, dark colors with the shadows rising towards the ceiling in long angles. The tall black dresser gleamed with nothing on it but John's picture, enlarged from a little one, with John's eyes very black when they should have been blue. Statements similar to this one present Granny Weatherall's clear exaggeration and visual manipulation of what is around her. Through doing so, the reader's understanding of Granny Weatherall's perspective and condition is expanded upon. Overall, the imagery in this story is essential. It greatly advances the characterization and setting development and gives the reader a better and more in-depth understanding of what is going on.
There are 4 main themes in The Jilting of Granny Weatherall. There's death, abandonment, control, and feminism. So obviously through this story, Granny Weatherall is dying because she is sick, and at first she doesn't want to accept it, but she does know that she is sick and dying. And she already did go through an experience where she thought she was dying when she was 60. In the passage, there's a quote that states, "She had spent so much time preparing for death, there was no need for bringing it up again. Let it take care of itself for now." So the first time she really prepared, and she made farewell trips to her children and grandchildren. And so since she's already prepared once for death, this time she's more prepared and feels that there's not much left for her to do. Also, 2 other characters supposedly died. Hapsy, and nowhere in the story really states that she did die, but Granny Weatherall was seeing her when she was dying and talking about reaching for her, so that correlates to Hapsy being dead. And John, who also died after she had her children with him, and he kind of left her alone to raise the children by herself, which leads into the theme of abandonment, which John did almost abandon her because he died and left her alone with the kids. And another main person who abandoned her was George, who left her at the altar, which is a very impactful event in her life because your wedding is supposed to be happy and a good time for gathering with family, but George ruined it by abandoning her at the altar. And then at the end, she felt as if God was abandoning her because she asked him for a sign that she was okay and peaceful to die. But once again, he abandoned her by not giving her a sign. And she did mention George leaving her at the altar. She said, again, no bridegroom and priest in the house, which is all relating to her feeling abandoned. The third theme in the story is control, which I found this was an interesting theme because Granny is literally on her deathbed and she is thinking about cleaning the house, and she mentions cleaning, folding, straightening things up, and I just found that's very weird to think about when you're dying because I know most people would not be thinking about that. The author states it made her feel like rolling up her sleeves and putting the whole place to rights again, which is just very odd to think about when you're on your deathbed. And she seems very upset when things don't go the way they're supposed to. Like when George left her at the altar, she couldn't control it, and she does not like things that she can't control. The last theme is feminism, which I also see strongly throughout the passage, that she almost has to prove that she is strong enough to do things on her own. So when John died, she was left to raise her children all on her own, and the author mentions that sometimes she wanted to see John again and point to them and say, well, I didn't do so badly, did I? She really wants to show John that she did this on her own and she was successful and her kids turned out well, so that really proves a point of feminism, that women can do things without men. Again, she mentions this when Cornelia asks her mother if there's anything she can do for her, and Granny says, I want you to find George, find him, and be sure to tell him that I forgot him. So Granny just wants to show that George did not affect her, even though he did, but she just wants to show and prove that she moved on and she had a successful life and raised her kids and found a new husband and had a good life after George, and she was able to live and thrive after him.